This is Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now!, the exception to the rulers. I'm Amy Goodman. Attending today's funeral of King Hussein are President Clinton, as well as representatives of countries that the U.S. has recently bombed, from Iraq to the Sudan. And as the president's impeachment trial nears its end this week, his policy towards Iraq, including prolonged bombing and economic sanctions, are being increasingly criticized. Just last week, the group Voices in the Wilderness, which opposes U.S.-UN sanctions against Iraq, completed a 250-mile walk from the Pentagon to the United Nations in protest of U.S. policy towards Iraq. According to UN estimates, the sanctions are responsible for the deaths of more than 1 million Iraqi children. We turn now to Professor Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, well-known political dissident, author of many books, his latest, Profit Over People. Just a few weeks ago, he talked about the issue of Iraq in a speech entitled The Crisis in Iraq, Understanding U.S. Motives Behind Sanctions and Confrontation.
Well, you've all seen, I assume, the title of the meeting. And I'd like to begin by distancing myself a little bit from it and just adding some qualifications which I think ought to be kept in mind in any such discussion. So I'll say it once and then forget about it. When we talk about the motives behind some state policy, in the first place, when it's a recent one, we have no internal evidence. We don't have documentary evidence. So we don't have evidence about the planning. But that doesn't really matter much. If we had a full record, including transcripts of everything that was said, we still really wouldn't have the answer. And in fact, the participants wouldn't know the answer either. And furthermore, that's something we all know from our personal experience. If you try to figure out your own motives in doing something, turns out they're complex and there's a mixture and it's very hard to sort them out, and you may not be the best judge. And that's true whether it's personal affairs or affairs of state. There are complicated motives, and even the participants don't know what they are. We can at best surmise and try to analyze, but there should be always a level of skepticism. I'm not going to add it anymore, but it should be an undercurrent for everything I say or everything you read anywhere else or hear anywhere else. Well, with that said, let me now sound confident from now on. There's a kind of a reasonable way to proceed to figure out what the motives are. We can run through possibilities, see if some of them can be excluded, and we can sort of narrow it down on some possibilities that are left. The one that immediately comes to mind, and the first one to pay attention to, is the one that is universally expressed and vociferously expressed and never questioned. Now, that's close to true. Like maybe there's some statistical error and it's occasionally questioned, but you'd have to look hard to find it. That is, you hear it in high places, Tony Blair or Madeleine Albright, commentary, reporting, editorials. I'll just take one example because it's close to home, the Boston Globe. But this is completely typical, so it's unfair to pick the Globe. The day of the latest bombings, there was an editorial called a Just Attack. And there was one reason for it, and it's a standard one. Saddam is a vengeful despot who has already used chemical and biological weapons on his own citizens, which is the ultimate horror. Now, obviously, such a creature has to be destroyed, poses an enormous threat, can't be tolerated, so you bomb him, you impose sanctions, and so on. That's essentially the universal view, the universal explanation, unchallenged. The kind of instructive exercise would be to check to see to what extent there's been any question raised about that justification. Well, that justification does have at least one merit. It's very easily tested. It takes a minute to test it. You simply have to ask what was the U.S.-British reaction when Saddam Hussein carried out the ultimate horror, that is, used chemical weapons against his own people. He certainly did, no doubt that he's a monster. And he certainly carried out this act of, he's a vengeful despot who has used chemical weapons against his own people. That's undoubtedly true, namely in 1988, when he carried out a major several times, gassing campaign against Kurds. He also used nerve gas and chemical weapons and other chemical weapons and so on in the war against Iran that was just finishing up at that time. In fact, the use of increased till the end. So it happened, and there is a reaction on the part of the United States and Britain and the Boston Globe, and everybody else is talking about it, and we can see what that reaction is. It's on the record, Well, the reaction was that the United States and Britain increased their support for their favorite monster. They'd been supporting him avidly right through his worst crimes, and after the gassing, they increased the support. It's not, a secret. You can easily discover it. How did they increase the support? Well, in some interesting ways. The U.S. had been providing Iraq with all kinds of aid, but particularly at that point, they increased, the Reagan and later Bush administrations increased the subsidized food aid. Subsidized means, you guys are paying for it. Subsidized agricultural exports to Iraq. Now, why did, Iraq is an agricultural producer, had been a country, which one of the few countries in the region which was actually an efficient producer of food and even exporter. So what did it need agricultural exports for? Well, that was actually connected with the gassing of the Kurds. Saddam Hussein, the vengeful despot, was destroying agricultural areas and the people who lived in them. So therefore there was actually a food shortage. And therefore we had to come to the rescue to help out with this project of gassing Kurds in the north. And we did by increasing the subsidized agricultural exports to Iraq, essentially for that reason. At that time, this continued. So during the invasion of Panama, George Bush took off a moment to announce that we were going to increase this is December 1989, a year later, we're going to increase the credits to Iraq to allow them to purchase from U.S. agricultural and other producers. It wasn't just agricultural. I don't think this was reported in the press, nor, as far as I could discover, was it reported that one senator, Senator Inouye from Hawaii, thought this was kind of surprising and asked for clarification. And he was given an official clarification by the State Department, which, again, I don't think was reported. He was told, official government policy, that we were going to increase our support for our favorite vengeful despot and mass murderer. They didn't say that. But we were going to increase the support to Saddam Hussein, that's the globe, because, here it is, it would increase U.S. exports and put the United States in a better position to deal with Iraq on human rights issues. Okay. Well, there didn't have to be any laughter because it wasn't reported. But at that time, let's forget the small thing about increasing U.S. exports, meaning increasing the profits for agribusiness and high technology industry and so on. At that time, the line was we are in a better position to deal with Iraqi human rights issues if we subsidize the monster. A year later, it turned out that we're in a better position to deal with human rights issues if we starve the Iraqi people into submission. Somehow you're not supposed to notice that the line changed for some reason, but whatever reason it changed for clearly had nothing to do with the ultimate horror, the using of chemical weapons against his own people, because that had already happened, and it just led us to increase the support. Okay, so put that in the back of our minds. In fact, this issue certainly has arisen. I mean, for example, Madeleine Albright, as perhaps you recall, was asked on national TV about a year or 2 years ago, I guess, 1996. She was asked on 60 Minutes what she thought about the fact that it was reported that about 500,000 Iraqi children had died as a result of the sanctions, which are putting us in a better position to deal with Iraqi human rights violations. And she said she agreed that this was a hard choice, but she said, we think the price is worth it. Okay, so that's the moral level of the way in which we deal with Iraqi human rights violations by killing 500,000 Iraqi children. We think the price, we're willing to pay that price. That's nice to hear. The subsidies for our favorite killer when he was carrying out the ultimate horror were not restricted to subsidized agricultural exports. They also included technical equipment, dual-use equipment that could be used for military purposes, helicopters, for example, a lot of equipment which could even be used for production of chemical and biological warfare. This was all revealed afterwards. That went on. At the time, there was suspicion that Saddam Hussein had biological warfare facilities. The U.S. denied it. Because he's our friend, after all. He wouldn't do that sort of thing. But they were discovered by a very good journalist. He was at that time the Middle East reporter for ABC television, Charlie Glass. He was able to find high-level Iraqi defectors in London, general actually, and from information that he got from them, using French commercial satellites, which are low grade, but certainly nothing like what the Pentagon has. He was able to locate and identify biological warfare facilities. And ABC television let him run a spot on the news showing biological warfare facilities, giving the evidence from defecting Iraqi generals. Then they switched immediately to their Pentagon correspondent, who poo-pooed it, said, no, the Pentagon says this is nonsense, forget about it, and the story died. Now, those same biological warfare facilities are being presented as proof that this reincarnation of Attila the Hun has to be destroyed by massacring his population. Same ones. And you're not supposed to remember that either. Right, according to Iraqi dissidents, there has been for a long time a ban, an official ban, U.S. government ban against any contact with Iraqi dissidents, the democratic opposition. It's not because they're big radicals or anything like that. The head is a London banker, others are professionals. But there was a ban, and according to Iraqi dissidents, that ban was instituted forcefully right after the last gassing episode, so as not to irritate our friend Saddam Hussein. I can't vouch for that, but that the ban has been in operation is absolutely true. In fact, it's been reiterated repeatedly. After we got up to December 1989, January 1990, a few months after that, in April, a group of high-ranking U.S. senators went to Iraq. They met with Saddam in the Kurdish city of Mosul. Remember, the Kurds are the ones who are getting gassed. The delegation was headed by Robert Dole, who brought the president's greetings to Saddam. Alan Simpson, who I think is over at the Kennedy School now. Pardon? Is he? Yeah. He was in the delegation. He told Saddam that Saddam's problems are not with the American government, which has no objections to him. They are with some journalists, kind of loose cannons. And he advised Saddam that what he should do is invite them to Iraq so they could kind of see for themselves, and be disabused of these notions. An Israeli scholar, Middle East scholar, who's writing about this in retrospect, says accurately that the fawning before the dictator reminded him of Munich. That's a pretty good analogy. Well, that's up to April 1990. That's already 2 years after the Halabja massacre, the ultimate horror. And this carries us up to, this continues up until the day of the invasion of Kuwait. Okay, so that's when overwhelmingly Saddam Hussein's crimes were committed during that period. Some of the worst ones were committed afterwards. I'll come to that. But the major ones were committed up till that period, and the U.S. supported them all the way through. In fact, with a good deal of enthusiasm. So did Britain. That tells us something. It tells us that they cannot, just by elementary logic, the crimes can't be the reason why we have to destroy the monster. I mean, nothing could be more obvious than that. Well, what about the threat posed by Saddam Hussein? That's real. That threat peaked in the late 1980s, thanks to our support. That's the time when he was most threatening and most powerful. There's a measure of how great the threat was. That was he was then at war. He had attacked Iran with our support, and there was a war going on. He was unable to defeat Iran. That's a country which had just decimated its officer corps and top military at the time of the revolution, Khomeini revolution, the revolution which led to Khomeini. Even with the Iranian military largely decimated, Iraq was unable to defeat them with the support of the United States, Russia, Britain, Western Europe, and the Arab states. So that gives you a measure of the threat at its peak. But the U.S. Today, in comparison, Iraq is, as Charlie Glass again wrote in a recent article, the Iraqi army is approximately back to what it was when the British established it as a means to suppress the population violently so that the rulers would be able to export oil to the West and ensure that the profits go to the West, not to the people of the region. That's the role of most of the armies in the Middle East. And the Iraqi army is about back to that level. Its equipment is antiquated. It's far weaker than it was. A lot of the weapons have been destroyed, not so much by bombing, but by the inspection system, which has destroyed a lot of weapons, and, of course, by the destruction of the economy. So, yes, it's a threat. It was a much greater threat 10 years ago. And how did the U.S. and Britain react to the threat at its peak? Well, I've already mentioned it, but the main reaction was to increase the threat. That was the reaction at the peak of the threat. And the U.S. took it very seriously. You want to remember how serious it was? Bear in mind that Iraq was the only country, actually there's only one other country, Israel, but apart from Israel, Iraq is the only country that was authorized to attack U.S. Ships and to kill U.S. sailors. That authorization isn't given to anyone else. In May, I think, 1987, Iraqi missiles struck the U.S. destroyer Stark, killing 37 sailors, 37 personnel, and they got a kind of tap on the wrist, but that's it. That's an unusual authorization. That shows you're really committed to somebody. What was the U.S. Stark doing there? Well, the U.S. Navy at that time was being introduced into the Gulf to back up Iraq and support him in the war against Iran and, of course, in his war against his own population. That continued. That alliance strengthened. A year later, in July 1988, a U.S. warship, the Vincennes, shot down an Iranian commercial airliner just taking off from the Iranian airport. A commercial airliner.
Professor Noam Chomsky speaking on the crisis in Iraq in Boston just a few weeks ago. Professor Chomsky, world-renowned political activist and analyst, professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.